The thermostat read 94 degrees at midnight, when Mia knocked on his door, wearing nothing but a thin white robe, holding her pillow against her chest like a shield. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet magic of everyday love, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. This story is for you. Dev Marino had never thought much about the air conditioning unit in his Phoenix apartment, until the night it decided to die during the worst heat wave the city had seen in a decade. He'd moved into the two-bedroom unit with Mia Reyes 8 months earlier, a practical arrangement born out of mutual necessity rather than friendship. She'd answered his roommate listing after her previous living situation fell apart, and he'd needed someone to split the rent after his college buddy moved out for a job in Denver. They were cordial in the way strangers sharing a kitchen learn to be. Polite good mornings, careful boundaries, the occasional shared pizza when neither felt like cooking. Dev worked long hours as a structural engineer at a firm downtown, coming home most nights too drained to do anything but collapse onto his mattress. Mia worked as a graphic designer from a cramped desk in her bedroom, freelancing her way through a career that hadn't quite taken off yet. Always a few invoices behind on rent, but somehow always making it work in the end. That particular July, the heat had turned the city into something hostile. The news anchors kept repeating the number 118 degrees, like saying it enough times might make it less real. Dev remembered coming home that Tuesday evening, stepping into the apartment, and immediately noticing something wrong. The air felt thick, stagnant, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with normal summer warmth. By 9 that night, the indoor temperature had climbed past 90, and by 11, the ancient window unit that served their living room had let out one final rattling groan and gone completely silent. Dev had called the emergency maintenance line 4 times. Each call ended in a recorded message, promising a callback that never came. Their landlord, a distant man named Harold, who managed 6 properties and answered his phone only when it suited him, texted back a single line explaining that a technician couldn't come until Thursday at the earliest. That left 2 full nights of unbearable heat stretching ahead of them, like a punishment neither had earned. Dev's bedroom, on the shaded side of the building, held onto slightly cooler air than the rest of the apartment, a fact he hadn't given much thought to until Mia knocked on his door a little after midnight. He remembered opening it to find her standing in the hallway in a thin white robe, hair damp with sweat, pillow clutched to her chest, her eyes carrying an exhaustion that went beyond just the heat. She asked, quietly, almost apologetically, if she could sleep in his room that night, just on the floor, just until the heat broke. She said her room felt like an oven, that she'd tried everything: wet towels, a bowl of ice in front of a fan, sleeping on top of the covers with the window cracked, and none of it had worked. Dev, still half asleep and startled by the request, stepped aside without much thought and told her to take the bed. He'd manage on the floor. What followed that night wasn't romantic in any obvious sense. It was 2 exhausted, overheated people lying a few feet apart in the dark, both too uncomfortable to sleep properly, filling the silence eventually with quiet conversation because neither could drift off anyway. Dev learned, somewhere around 2 inches the morning, that Mia had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, the only child of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their trailer's electric bill paid, which was partly why Mia had endured that first sweltering night in her own room, for as long as she had some old, stubborn instinct telling her that discomfort was simply something you pushed through quietly, that asking for help was a last resort reserved for true emergencies. Mia learned that Dev had lost his father to a heart attack 3 years earlier, suddenly, with no warning, and that grief had left him oddly rigid about routines and self-sufficiency, as though keeping tight control over his small daily habits could somehow protect him from the chaos of losing someone else without warning. They didn't solve anything that first night. They simply talked until exhaustion finally pulled them both under. Mia curled on top of the comforter, Dev stretched out on a thin blanket on the hardwood floor beside the bed. When Dev woke the next morning to his alarm, stiff, backed and disoriented, he found Mia already gone, her pillow neatly placed back on her own bed down the hall. No note, no mention of the night before, as though it might not have happened at all if neither of them spoke of it. The heat wave, however, wasn't finished with them. Thursday's promised repair appointment came and went with no technician in sight. And by Friday, Harold texted to say the part needed for the unit was on backorder, with no clear timeline for arrival. The city stayed locked in triple digits. The apartment, without proper airflow, became genuinely dangerous to sleep in for anyone not in the shaded bedroom, and so a strange, unspoken routine began to form. Each night, Mia would appear in Dev's doorway sometime after 11, pillow in hand. And each night, Dev would offer the bed and take the floor. Though by the third night, Mia insisted they alternate, refusing to let him sacrifice his own comfort indefinitely on her behalf. By the fourth night, they'd worked out an arrangement. Neither had explicitly proposed the bed divided by a rolled-up blanket down the middle, an imperfect but functional boundary that let them both actually sleep, instead of one suffering on hardwood, while the other tossed guiltily above. It was during those strange, humid nights that Dev began to notice things about Mia he'd been too walled off to see during 8 months of polite distance. He noticed that she hummed faintly under her breath when she was nervous, a habit she seemed unaware of. He noticed that despite her financial stress, she never complained about money directly, only referenced it obliquely through jokes about instant ramen or apologies for being a few days late on her share of the electric bill. He noticed the calluses on her fingers from years of drawing before she'd switched to digital work, and the way her eyes lit up genuinely without performance whenever she talked about a project she was proud of, even if no client had paid her fairly for it yet. Mia, in turn, began to see past the controlled, closed-off version of Dev she'd quietly built her assumptions around. She noticed that his rigid routines weren't coldness, but a kind of quiet fear, a man trying to hold his world steady after it had once buckled without warning beneath him. She noticed that he left the porch light on every night, a small habit he eventually admitted came from his mother's insistence, years ago, that a lit porch meant someone was always welcome home. She noticed that despite his exhaustion from 12-hour workdays, he never once made her feel like a burden for interrupting his sleep. Never once suggested she should have just endured the heat on her own. The real turning point came on the 6th night, when the heat index pushed even higher and the building's backup generator flickered out entirely for almost 3 hours, plunging the apartment into stifling, windowless darkness. Mia, more anxious than usual, admitted quietly in the dark that heat wasn't actually her biggest fear that week. Money was. She'd lost a major client that same week, a contract that would have covered nearly 2 months of expenses, and she confessed, voice tight and controlled in the way people speak when they're trying very hard not to cry, that she'd been lying awake most nights doing math in her head that never quite worked out. Dev, without overthinking it, reached across the blanket boundary they'd built and simply took her hand. He didn't offer solutions or empty reassurances. He just stayed there, present, letting her know through the small, steady weight of his hand that she wasn't doing this math alone in the dark anymore. It was the first time either of them had voluntarily crossed the blanket line, and neither pulled away. After that night, something between them shifted permanently, though neither rushed to name it. Dev started leaving extra grocery items on Maya's side of the fridge, unlabeled, unspoken, simply there when she needed them. Mia started leaving small sketches on sticky notes on his bathroom mirror, quick doodles that made him laugh before his morning commute, a kind of gentle counterbalance to the seriousness he carried so heavily. The AC unit was finally repaired on the 9th day, the technician arriving almost apologetically late, and cool air flooded back into the apartment for the first time in over a week. That night, out of habit more than necessity, Mia still appeared in Dev's doorway around 11, pillow in hand, and instead of the usual quiet arrangement, she simply asked, a little shyly, if it would be strange to keep doing this even now that her room was livable again. Dev, without hesitation, told her it would be far stranger to stop. In the months that followed, their relationship deepened slowly, without the dramatic velocity of a movie romance, but with the steady, accumulating warmth of two people who had been unexpectedly forced into vulnerability and had chosen, again and again, not to retreat from it. Dev helped Mia put together a proper portfolio website that eventually landed her 2 stable, long-term clients, work that finally matched her actual talent with fair payment. Mia, in turn gently pushed Dev to loosen the rigid architecture of his life just slightly, encouraging him to take a weekend trip for the first time in years, to let go of the porch light ritual just once and trust that home would still be there waiting. They eventually turned the old blanket boundary into something of a private joke between them, a symbol of the exact moment. Two cautious, self-protective people decided that closeness, however inconvenient or unplanned, was worth the risk. By the time the following summer's heat rolled around, the two-bedroom apartment had quietly become a one-bedroom in practice. Mia's old room repurposed into a shared studio, space filled with her sketches and his blueprints side by side. Dev often thinks back to that first night, to the sight of her standing in his doorway in a thin white robe, pillow held against her chest like armor, asking a question that felt small at the time, but ended up changing the entire shape of his life. He understands now that sometimes the people who walk quietly into our lives during our most uncomfortable, unguarded moments are exactly the people we needed all along. And that comfort, real comfort, was never about the temperature of a room, but about finally not having to face the heat alone. If this story touched even a small part of your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories like this one. And before you go, we'd love to know which country are you watching from tonight. Drop a comment below and let us know you were here.